part of our Wilderness Years theme, we're joined by Jon Davies, who is a television and video director primarily associated with documentaries and spin-off videos associated to Doctor Who, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and Blake 7. He was responsible for directing the documentary More Than 30 Years in the TARDIS, and he's here to talk about that with me in our two-part presentation today. Kevin, how are you?
Hello, good evening. Well, it's lovely to be here. I'm quite fond of Fantom films. I used to be a regular down at Chiswick, so yeah, nice to be asked back. Thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you with us. The 30th anniversary seems like a very long time ago now, and
well, we're rapidly rocketing towards the 60th, so yes, it is a very long time.
And back then, in the 30th anniversary year, Doctor Who was a little bit unloved, it's fair to say. It was a dark time for our series. There was no real vision for what would be, and it wasn't there. And we had the occasional books and a few bits and pieces, but we really didn't have a huge amount. So the 30th anniversary needed something a bit special, I think. And the idea of a documentary came about, I understand.
Well, I was finishing up on my sort of directing debut for the Beeb, which was the making of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Now, I'd worked on the series some 13 years earlier, and I'd shot a lot of behind-the-scenes footage, and I'd made this nice little documentary with a fantastic crew. Friends like Mark Ayres were involved in that. And we were coming towards the end of the editing, and David Jackson, who was my producer at BBC Video, said, you got any ideas for the 30th anniversary? Well, that sort of completely surprised me and Mark. And we thought, well, yes, I'm sure we can come up with something. And I think I spent most of the next sort of 6 months or so coming up with various ideas. There was a slight sidebar in that I shot about 9 interviews for the making of Blake 7, which was a project we were going to do, but was ultimately shelved because Terry Nation's famous agent wouldn't be rushed. And BBC Video, you know, they wanted it out in time for October, which meant we had to be done by August. And it all compacted so much that we just had to put that one on ice for a bit. So the Doctor Who thing stepped up a little bit, and I was invited to a meeting with John Whiston in David Jackson's office. It was a formal introduction, and John Whiston had said he very much enjoyed the making of Hitchhikers, and would I like to consider doing something similar for Doctor Who. But he also at that time said that he also wanted some little 5-minute pieces. They were very much, he was in charge of the Late Show productions, which was a sort of autonomous unit within music and arts at the BBC. And they were famous for doing theme nights. I don't know if anyone remembers, but BBC Two used to have lots of these theme nights. They would pick a topic or pick a TV show, and they would celebrate it with a whole evening of programs. And it looked like that was kind of the style of what it was going to be. So I wrote many pitches, lots of different ideas. One of them was a thing called Nation's Creations, which was all about Terry Nation and his history. That involved a little boy going across a war-torn landscape and meeting lots of different characters from Terry Nation's stuff. I think that was inspired by, you know, imagery from Genesis of the Daleks. They didn't go for that one. They didn't go for a couple of other ideas. One idea was a thing called The Legend Begins, which was going to be a dramatisation of the creation of Doctor Who. Does that sound familiar?
Mm-hmm.
But they decided, although that one did actually go on to Verity Lambert's desk, and she loved the idea, but she said she couldn't commission it. It needed the BBC to approve. And the Late Show production said, we just simply don't have the budget to do a full-blown drama. Try and think of something a bit simpler.
At least we got it in the end.
We did, and I'm going to say right now that Mark Gatiss did a much better job of it than I would have done. So I couldn't have written that. That was beautiful. So anyway, eventually it came down to the idea, and I came up with this thing called 30 Years in the TARDIS, pitched a rough idea. It was a sort of what eventually it became. Pinched some bits from other formats that I'd written. I had also written a thing called The Unsung Heroes of Doctor Who, which was going to be the 5-minuters. and we were going to look at the visual effects department, and we were going to look at this, that, and the other different topics, you know, within the 5-minuters. And of course, ultimately, we did do the 5-minuters, or other people did 5 of them. I got to do 1. And so, you know, lots of that stuff survived. But what I do remember was very odd was on the day that I was told that this 30 years in the TARDIS was going to go ahead, was the same day that I was wrestling with whether I was going to direct a documentary about Doctor Who for BBC One, or whether I was going to be post-production supervisor on the big Doctor Who drama, The Dark Dimension. And for 2 hours on this one, what got dubbed later Freaky Friday, for 2 hours, I was pacing up and down the kitchen at home, which is where the phone was on the breakfast bar. And I couldn't make up my mind. What was I going to do? Be the big fish in the small pool, or, you know, a small cog in this big Doctor Who film? And luckily for me, the decision was taken away from me, because I got a phone call 2 hours later saying Dark Dimension was cancelled. And that's a whole other big story. So the way was clear for me. I was going to be doing this big documentary. I went in to meet John Whiston again. It was very funny about John Whiston. We both recognised each other, but we couldn't think where from. And it was quite some weeks before I suddenly realised that he'd been to my house many years earlier when he was a lowly researcher for Saturday Review in 1985, because we had a committee meeting there for Laszlo Lyricon, which was a big hitchhikers convention. And he was the researcher on the BBC crew that was going to come and film at that event. So yes, we had met before, and he'd been to my house, but we both had completely forgotten about it. It's just like, hey, I know this guy, you know. Anyway, he gave me an awesome amount of, rope to do as I will. He wanted a Doctor Who version of The Making of Hitchhiker, which he said, we want all those sort of graphic bits that you broke it up with. And I thought I couldn't understand that, because that was very much Hitchhiker style. And I didn't think Doctor Who would be like that. Now I see the big problem that I had, and it became a problem later on, was to recognise the house style. And I've always thought about this ever since. I learned a lot on 30 Years in the TARDIS, but one of the things I learned is that you've got to work within the constraints of the customer. And the Late Show very much had their own style of programme making, and I didn't know how to slot into that. I was still quite young and inexperienced. Young. I was, 31, 32, something like that. But I'd been an animator for 13 years. I'd done the Hitchhiker's Guide at the beginning of my career. I'd done Roger Rabbit during the 80s. I was part of the big crew on that in London. But I was looking to escape from the drawing board and do more live action stuff. So this was a big deal. BBC One. It was a golden opportunity to do something exciting.
And it sounds like you were fairly clear early on what you wanted it to be. How involved did the BBC want to be in trying to guide you, perhaps away from what you had in your mind?
Well, that was what I was about to say earlier. Is that on practically the first day in the office, I was told to rewrite the proposal, to actually narrow it down and nail exactly what it is I was going to be doing. So I'd been given the job, and suddenly I'm having to rewrite it, And I wasn't computer savvy at that point. I remember sitting at the BBC computer, and the very experienced production secretary that they gave me, or production assistant, Sheila Castles, I think she'd been installed in Television Centre, while they were laying the foundations, and they'd built the place around her. This was to be her last project, ironically. Poor woman. She was retiring after and I think after the exhausting process, I think she was glad of it as well. But that was the point. They gave me a very experienced production assistant and a very experienced researcher, and Jane Rundle, and an office. And for that glorious few short months, I had the only office at the BBC with Doctor Who on the door. Quite literally, I made a sign. But it was, you know, I was a pig in doodah. You know, I was very, very pleased with myself, and got on the phone and immediately started involving all the fans that I knew that had Daleks or Cybermen costumes, or what did we have? Draconian and Ogron, you know, anybody that I could think of that I knew who was a fan that could come and be involved. So that added a lot of sort of production quality to the whole proceedings. And I think the other half of the office was a couple of other program makers who were doing something else, I don't know what. And I think my voice yakking away on the telephone rather excitedly was getting on their wick, so I was asked to tone it down a bit. But it was exciting, you know. I realised one of the first things I did was a little pet thing that I'd always wanted to know, and that was I got Sheila to place adverts in, now what was the area, Doncaster or somewhere, where I knew that William Hartnell had attended air shows in the 60s, and the other one I think was down at Coldrose, and it was to put adverts in their papers to say, has anyone got any photographs or footage? I was hoping that someone might have 8mm footage. Lo and behold, we got three people came forward. One of them was very overexposed, but the other two were great, and of course, you know, quite a bit of it got into the program.
And of course, these were gems we previously not had as well, which was kind of
exactly nice. And that was, well, that's difficult to remember, isn't it? That's how it was at the time, is that you wanted to find those nuggets that either hadn't existed before or that hadn't had an airing. So, for instance, I spoke to a friend of mine who was an avid collector and had worked at the BBC, and he'd had sort of good connections with the design department, and that was Jan Vincent Rudsky, who had been, when I first became a member of organised fandom on 1976, when DWAS just began, he was the president. And anyway, I knew that he had some snippets of film from when they'd done Who's Doctor Who. He had those little trims of either side of the clip of Galaxy 4 that went into Who's Doctor Who. So I asked him, is there any chance we could get that? We never did seem to hook up dates to get it transferred. But what he did help me with was, I said that I'd seen Julian Vince's Dalek Emperor at Panopticon. Very frustrating that year's Panopticon, because everyone was there, all the usual guests, and I wanted to interview all of them, but at the time it was still secret that we were going to do this program. It hadn't actually been locked down, you know, signed and definitely got the green light. So I was so desperate. I really wished I'd had a film crew at that Panopticon. But the one thing I did see was Julian's Emperor Dalek. Oh, we've got to have that. But if we're going to have that, we're going to have to build a corner at least of the room, the throne room that he was in. And Jan surprised me because he said, I think I've got some floor plans for that. Very exciting. So, so I took them along to my set designer that I chose, who was Andrew Howe Davis, who's no relation at all, but he'd been the set designer on Hitchhikers, and I'd just interviewed him the year before. Hadn't seen him for about 12 years. But I saw him the year before, and I thought, well, he's the only BBC set designer that I know. And he was working all sorts of high-profile comedy shows and all sorts of things. He brought his assistant in, Philip, and I showed them the plans. I said, I'd like to build this. We've got the Emperor Dalek, but we need the lattice work, you know, concertina walls behind him. And they looked at the plans, and Andrew said, wait a minute, this is Thompson, isn't it? He recognised the writing, and then down in the corner of the plans was his name. So he recognised the writing even before he saw his name in the corner. And he said, he's freelance now, he's working for us. Such a weird coincidence. This is like a Hitchhiker's style coincidence thing, you know? It's all blah, 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 it's all connected. So anyway, yes, he got Chris in, and he became part of the design crew.
I can certainly understand how much enjoyment you were having in the planning process, because I think you've already said it was like it was like your birthday. You were just having the fun that you wanted, and you were exercising all the things you would do as a fan to try and put together something that you know that the fans would really want.
And as you say, it was at a time when Doctor Who was off air. You know, it had been dead to all intents and purposes for 3 or 4 years. There were rumblings. We'd heard sort of stories that maybe something was afoot, that they were going to maybe do something with Doctor Who. As you know, it took another 2 or 3 years before it bore fruit. And of course, we asked Gentov about it, but I'm getting ahead of myself there. Yeah. So yeah, it was being given the key to the toy box. You know, it was, everything was there. Sadly, of course, you know, the BBC was going through a massive period of change at the time. Producer choice had just come in. John Burt had shaken everything up, and the BBC, all the departments were practically, you know, they were all separately going freelance. I remember Mike Tucker from BBC Visual Effects showed me their sort of sales brochure for the visual effects department to sell their wares to all the other departments. It was crazy. Each department of the BBC was becoming a business. And it was a very strange time. And ultimately, I think I was the first person to bring a fully freelance crew into a television centre studio, you know, and Sheila Castles was horrified because she was proper old school. But then, you know, she had this fantastic contacts book of all the people and all the different people in different departments and how they all work together. But there were 3 departments she'd never worked with, which was costume, makeup, and visual effects, the 3 things that I was most interested in, because she'd been in the music and arts department doing documentaries, so they hadn't really needed that kind of stuff. I was very excited to have the full range of all the Doctor Who that existed at the time to use in the edit. That was quite daunting in itself. I think I'd underestimated that part, just how much sifting through it was going to take.
There were some nice clips in there, though. It's got to be.
There were, and I've got various people to thank for that. You know, what became the Doctor Who restoration team: Paul Venesis, Steve Roberts. You know, that and up in Birmingham was what's his name, Richard Molesworth. They were all friends. They had a massive session of editing together bits and pieces that they could get from all the master tapes and various formats, and supplying me with, I think we had something like 7 long extract reels from which I could dip in and take whatever I needed, you know.
And of course, archive material was hard to get in those days as well. So even to have a chance to play with the lists on that, I'm sure was great. So all the planning's going ahead here. At what point do you choose in the planning stage to introduce a narrative story coming through the documentary with the young boy?
It was part of the proposal that I'd written for, which was called Nations Creations, was a little boy experiencing all of Terry Nation's, you know, various characters and things and people that he met through his life. I think I was going to have the Frankenstein monster lumbering about, because part of the story was how Terry Nation had worked on that anthology series that was presented by Boris Karloff. I drew together all bits and pieces. I can't remember all the details now, but that was a little boy running through the whole thing. Now, I already had an off-air VHS of something the Late Show had done a few years earlier, which was the Batman special in '89, which had a little boy going into a basement. I think it was a basement, or was it a loft? Anyway, finding this massive Batman collection and going through the memorabilia, and you were seeing it through the little boy's eyes. And, you know, they played on the violence aspect and looking frightened and all that stuff. And because I was having to rewrite the whole proposal practically on the first day in the office, I just thought of that. And I thought, well, that's what the Late Show do. And then you intercut that, he drives you through it, and everything is interwoven, which I'd done the year before with the making of Hitchhikers. I'd had Simon Jones as Arthur Dent and David Dixon as Ford Prefect, coming in and out of the storyline. Peter Jones doing the voice and all that sort of thing, in and out of the documentary footage. And that's what I intended to do, and that's what John Wisdom wanted from me. And so really it kind of wrote itself in the end. It was using that Batman special as the sort of template. So I thought up various scenarios, and really I think it was coming from a fan point of view. It was, what are the most memorable images that I could think of from all the years of watching Doctor Who? I was born 2 years before Doctor Who began. And so, you know, my earliest memories were of William Hartnell. And it was like all the most memorable things I could think of and that I knew about from, you know, reading fan magazines and the various sort of, you know, textbooks about Doctor Who that had come out over the years. Which ones could we recreate? Costumes that I knew existed, or, you know, props like the Daleks and things. What could we do? I had a big thing about taking the Daleks over Westminster Bridge. I'd done it as a fan in 1978 with one Dalek, rather well made, but not terribly accurate Dalek, which we'd done. And back in those days, you could go up Downing Street. We'd rolled the Dalek up early one Sunday morning in summer, rolled the Dalek up Downing Street with an 8mm camera over my shoulder and the Dalek rattling over the cobbles behind me. This is like 7:30 in the morning, and we thought, oh, there's no policeman there. We just wanted to get a shot of the Dalek going past number 10 front door. But the policeman stepped out of the car that was parked at the curb, putting his hat on and doing the kind of, what's all this then? I went, it's a Dalek. And he goes, I know what it is. What do you want to do with it? I said, well, we want to film it going past. Oh, have you got a permit? What's one of those?
That you just wouldn't get away with today.
Well, during Thatcher's time, all the fence went up, of course. You know,
you caused it. That's what this was.
It was our fault. Dalek invasion, 1978. Yeah.
So the pre-production clearly well underway. Filming about to start, if not already started.
Yeah.
So what we're going to do, we're going to take a break, and we'll talk about that in the second part of our more than 30 years in the TARDIS discussion a little bit later in our Time Space Visualiser Wilderness Years event.